What would living in a one-dimensional world look like? The easiest way of imagining a one-dimensional world would be by taking a line and a dot. Well, the line you can see here isn't truly one-dimensional. This is because even though there is no depth, the line still has some height. The problem is, a line with no height is just impossible to see because it's so thin nothing can see it. So, for our purpose, we're just gonna keep this line and pretend it's only one-dimensional. Well, when the line would be a one-dimensional world, the dot would symbolize a one-dimensional life form, like a cat, mouse, bee or frog. So now we know how a one-dimensional world and life form would look like, but we still don't know how the world would look like from the perspective of a creature that lives in only one dimension. To show this, I'm going to split the screen into two parts. The bigger one is the perspective of the dot, while the smaller one is a top-down view of the line to see what's going on. When we start with the dot on the left side of the line, everything the dot can see is the color that surrounds it, which in this case would be purple. If we start to move the dot, the only thing that changes is the color the dot can see, so no shapes or objects are or can become visible, because it's impossible to display them in only one dimension. What you can see here is the big difference between our point of view and the perspective of someone in the first dimension, because we can easily see what color comes next, which would be impossible to do for someone who lives in only one dimension. Now we can ask the same question again. What would a two-dimensional world look like, and what would you see when you live in only two dimensions? Well, I've basically shown you both these things before, you just didn't know it. What made the one-dimensional world special was that you could only move along the line in one dimension, like a train on its tracks, while the entire world had no height or depth. A two-dimensional world is pretty similar to a one-dimensional one, but with height as the second dimension, which allows you to move up and down. Well, even though we now have a life form living in two dimensions, the same concepts and problems that we looked at with a one-dimensional life form still apply. Take this bus stop for example. Well, it also isn't truly two-dimensional due to the objects like the bushes, benches or just yourself overlapping and creating this perception of depth, which would be impossible in a two-dimensional world because we can only have something flat with width or height but no depth. If I ask you how you would leave this bus stop, it would be pretty easy, wouldn't it? Just step on the road and leave. But for someone in two dimensions, that is impossible, because stepping forward would imply that they could use the third dimension, which is depth. This means that for a two-dimensional life form, the bus stop, or here, this box, despite having no front or back walls, becomes a closed room, like a prison cell that no one can leave. Take a look at this other example, why perspective matters. Imagine you are back living in your two-dimensional world, and you have a magical altar where anything you place on it randomly disappears overnight, while other objects sometimes appear without explanation. From your perspective, the cause seems to be a strange black hole that grows and shrinks, appearing and disappearing at random, sometimes taking objects with it, while sometimes leaving new ones behind. You try to understand how it works, using everything you know from your daily life, but no explanation ever fully makes sense. Do you know why this happens? It is because the hole is not actually flat and it does not truly appear or disappear. Instead, it moves through your two-dimensional world. What you perceive as a hole is actually a three-dimensional ball bouncing up and down through a two-dimensional plane. When the ball intersects your world, it looks like a hole appears. When it moves away, the hole seems to vanish. In reality, it's simply moving along a dimension you cannot observe. Because you cannot perceive this third dimension, the behavior appears magical to you. However, from our perspective, as beings living in three dimensions, the situation is easy to understand. The same concept also applies to the box I showed you. For someone living in two dimensions, it is simply impossible to see what is inside this closed box or this red present, for example. But for a being that can observe from an additional dimension, like a god looking down from above, it would be possible to see everything at once, both inside and outside, which would be impossible to do when you only live in these two dimensions. So, now we know that a one-dimensional world is a line, and that from a one-dimensional perspective, only a single color is visible. If something intersects this line, similar to what I showed you with the ball in 2D space, then even though that object might have a shape, it would only appear as a change in color. A two-dimensional world is an infinite number of one-dimensional worlds stacked on top of each other. From the perspective of a creature inside this two-dimensional world, something we have talked about but not really shown, since we usually look at these examples from above, the experience would resemble a one-dimensional world. For example, the side of the box would just appear as a one-dimensional black line, with the color changing when looking at the edges of the box. In the same way, a three-dimensional world is an infinite number of two-dimensional worlds stacked on top of each other. Similar to a one- or two-dimensional life form, who would experience their world in one dimension less, we also only ever experience the world in two dimensions. This is quite easy to see when looking at the ball without anything to reference it to. Which of these three balls is actually three-dimensional? That's surprisingly hard to tell. Only because of lighting, small imperfections or movement can we assume the shape or dimensionality of an object. And even though we live in three dimensions, we can never see the entirety of a three-dimensional object, so its front and backside, at the same time. For someone living in 4 dimensions, this would be possible in the same way it is possible for us in 2 dimensions. But how would 4 dimensions look? Following our logic from a line to a square to a cube, we might imagine an infinite number of cubes stacked on top, or inside, or next to each other. None of these are actually true, and at this point, however, it becomes very hard to visualize, because it's not that simple and we do not live in 4 dimensions. One way you might have already seen this visualized is a tesseract, a cube where all of the faces of the cube are also cubes. But displaying this in 3 dimensions, or in this case even 2, is pretty much impossible. Well, maybe someone else on YouTube has done a better job of visualizing this, or explaining the 4th dimension, but I think you get the idea why perspective matters. At this point I have nothing more to say, so thank you for watching the video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, maybe consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, or watching another one of my videos. It would really help me out. Thank you.